Welcome to another edition of AP US History University High School. Today we're talking about just some of the major people involved in World War II, some of the major leaders. Um, this isn't like an extensive list, just some of the key figures. Some are just kind of nice to know in case you're on Jeopardy and just to be well-rounded and well-educated about this kind of stuff because it's very recent history as well. But others are very essential to know for the purposes of our class because they're going to come up again, especially during the Cold War. So we didn't talk much about the alliances and how the war got started and all of that because it's kind of review from last year as well. But to review the review again, it was the Axis powers and the Allies. So the Axis were the three main forces there. Nations involved in that alliance were Germany, Italy, and Japan. So Germany headed by the Führer, the leader Adolf Hitler, and his Nationalist Socialist Party ideology. Italy, Benito Mussolini, who was nicknamed Il Duce, and the Prime Minister of Japan, Hideki Tojo. But officially, it was the Emperor of Japan really that had the greatest sway with the people, right? It was this kind of galvanizing figure for Japanese citizens, but the real head of state that he orchestrated Pearl Harbor basically was Hideki Tojo. And of course, on the Allied side, there were actually many more nations. There was like 15 or 20 that played minor roles, but the three main belligerents in the Allies were Joseph Stalin in the USSR, the United States, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain. So this is Joseph Stalin, FDR, and Winston Churchill. But also in East Asia, Chiang Kai-shek and China. So China was the major ally, and although they were kind of under the control of Japan for most of the war, they were still, a major belligerent there, an ally, and they had the largest population in the world. That's why they suffered as high as 10 million casualties during World War II. The Soviet Union, 10 million dead, and the Soviet Union upwards of 20 million dead. These numbers are just astronomical. Okay, let's keep going then. So Winston Churchill, he's one of the most important figures in the 20th century, and I think there's a survey a few years ago where British people ranked the three most important British people in the history of the world, and they had Winston Churchill somewhere in the top three. So he's the prime minister, and he was a veteran of World War I as well. Well, I think he was an officer. But a lot of people credit just his toughness, his strength, his resolve as a leader to Britain's ability to face that Nazi blitz of London and the battle for Britain, as it was called as well. And then he also would help plan the post-war future of Europe and, to an extent, the whole world, really, with FDR and then later on with President Truman through a couple of conferences. He was not a fan of socialism, and he saw that as the world's next big conflict. A lot of people criticized him for that when he made his Iron Curtain speech after the war, but it was pretty prophetic. Here's a famous quote by him: "Never, never give up." Wait, never, never, never give up. Yeah, three nevers. Never give up. And of course, speaking of the Royal Air Force, who they were the ones that held off the German Luftwaffe, never was so much owed by so many, meaning by the entire British Empire and maybe even the whole world, to so few, to the pilots of the RAF. Here's what he thinks about socialism. It's a philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, the gospel of envy of the lower classes towards the upper classes, I suppose. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery. And maybe he was right about the equal sharing of misery, but we'll get to that later on with the Cold War, and therefore he wasn't too much of a fan of Joseph Stalin. Although they were allies during the war, he always viewed him with a wary eye. Stalin himself was a really paranoid leader of the Soviet Union, possibly the world's biggest mass murderer, maybe even more than, no, I would say definitely even more than Hitler. Because a lot of the deaths that Hitler caused were as a result of the war, whereas Stalin just rounded people up and sent them to his labor camps, the gulags in Siberia. Who knows how many tens of millions, perhaps, of his political enemies were sent to these gulags. After the war, this is pretty important, he sought to extend the influence of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe and other parts of the world as well. And his justification was that, well, Russia had been attacked by Napoleon, or excuse me, by Hitler, and before that by the Germans in World War I, and way before that by Napoleon, and it was just they needed buffer states. Was his argument there, but that is what contributed also to the rise of the Cold War. Chiang Kai-shek, also called Jiang Jieshi in China, was the leader of the Kuomintang, the nationalist party there, not the communists. So their enemies were the communists, but when Japan had invaded, Japan was the primary enemy. So he's this important ally for the United States and Great Britain in China. However, he's seen as like pretty corrupt. His administration not very responsive to the needs of Chinese peasants, and the Communist Party in China began to grow and influence and gain the support of the peasants, actually. So eventually the communists are victorious in 1949 after the war, and Chiang Kai-shek does remain a central figure there because he's going to flee to Taiwan, and the United States will recognize Taiwan as China, and not China as China. What about France? Well, they were overrun in 1940. Their Maginot Line did not hold against the Nazi Blitz, but one of their generals, Charles de Gaulle, fled to Great Britain, escaped rather to Great Britain along with a number of other French troops, and he was a general who led what became known as Free French Forces during World War II. So it was an actual army, and they were able to take back a number of French colonies that had fallen into German hands. But also, from Britain, he got on BBC radio, and he began to encourage French citizens to resist the Nazis, and possibly the strongest civilian resistance to Nazi occupation was in France, actually. So there's a lot of sabotaging and bombings and assassinations and things like that. So he's able to gain the control eventually of a lot of the French colonies, and in 1959 he was elected president, and he presided over France, I think, during their Algerian War, when Algeria was fighting for independence. Also, if you go to France, one of the airports there, the main airport, is Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, excuse me. What about Japan? Well, Hideki Tojo was a general, but then he became prime minister in 1940, but he'd been planning the attack on Pearl Harbor for years up to that, actually. So as prime minister, you could say he was the orchestrator of this war, and after the war he was executed for war crimes after the war. The Emperor Hirohito, however, was not executed after the war. Although he was the Emperor of Japan during this entire period of militarist expansion in the 20s and 30s and 40s, he was left in charge because he was such a central figure, could have been like this unifying force in Japan, and he was allowed to remain on the throne, and actually became kind of this symbol. It should say became the symbol of Japan's new state and recovery after the war. And by the 1920s or 30s, Japan had the 9th biggest economy in the world. That's pretty good. By the 1970s, Japan had the world's 2nd largest economy. And of course, they'd started this war to an extent. So that's pretty remarkable how they were able to do that. And they actually did that a lot with American support, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay, Nazi leaders. So these aren't generals necessarily, but these are the leaders of the party, the ideology that caused so much of this war in Europe. So in order for that to happen, how can a person like Hitler be elected in a democratic country? Well, you've got to influence the people, and the great influencer of the people, aside from Hitler, was this man. His name is Joseph Goebbels, and Goebbels was the propaganda minister. The posters and the children's stories and the movies and the speeches, a lot of them written and orchestrated by him. So he was extremely zealous, really fanatical. He actually believed in that stuff, basically. So he created that climate of anti-Semitism, especially in Germany. I don't know what happened to him after the war, whether he was captured and executed or he committed suicide like so many of the others. Another one was this man. Should have put him in a little bit later on. Actually, let me do this. No, let's not do this. Okay, Adolf Eichmann. He was a high-ranking official in the Schutzstaffel. The Schutzstaffel was like a paramilitary. They weren't like a full-on military unit. They were like military slash other stuff unit in Germany, the SS as it was known. And Eichmann is most infamous for, he was apparently a very intelligent man. His organizational talents had planned a lot of the logistics of the deportation and eventual extermination of the Jews. So it was his planning and genius, you could say, that organized the Holocaust. So what happened to him after the war is pretty infamous and reads kind of like an interesting, suspense novel. So he escaped to South America, to Argentina specifically. A lot of Nazis actually did, it is believed, escaped to Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. But he was actually captured by the Israeli Mossad. The Mossad is a very secret intelligence agency in Israel, kind of like the American CIA. And they captured him in Argentina. They brought him back to Israel, put him on trial, and he was executed for this new crime called crimes against humanity. Well, it was new right after the war, during the Nuremberg trials, where these people were tried. Another Nazi leader was this man. Anybody know who he is? He's possibly the second most powerful, well, not quite, maybe third, most powerful man in Germany. His name was Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering was the head of the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe was the German Air Force. So he was involved in the Nazi Party going back, way back to 1923 with Hitler in Munich and the Beer Hall Putsch. A putsch is like it's kind of like a coup. It's an attempted coup. But he failed to defeat the Royal Air Force. He failed in Russia, so Hitler lost a lot of faith in him. So for a couple of years, he pretty much devoted himself to stealing a lot of masterpieces of artwork, especially those confiscated from Jews who were sent to concentration camps and ghettos. He was later on sentenced to war crimes and crimes against humanity at Nuremberg as well, but he was not executed because he actually swallowed a pill of cyanide before he could be hanged. A number of Nazi leaders actually did that. This man was possibly one of the most delusional of all the Nazis. His name is Heinrich Himmler. Heinrich Himmler is the leader, was the head of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. And he is probably the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany at the time. He was just right below Hitler. He commanded the SS, very powerful group. And he is the one that is most directly responsible for the Holocaust. He set up and controlled those concentration camps. So it all fell under his ultimate direction. When he was captured after the war, he was shocked that the Allies were treating him as a war criminal. He really must have been pretty delusional at that point. And when he realized he was going to be put on trial, he actually also swallowed a cyanide pill and committed suicide. All right, to the Americans. General George S. Patton, Old Blood and Guts, as he was called. He was a really tough guy, born in, I think, 1885, served in World War I. He was a career military man in the 1930s. He commanded, first of all, the 7th Army and later on the 3rd Army in the war, but he's known for his skill in tank warfare. And during the 20s and 30s, he was a central figure in developing in the United States what's called armored warfare doctrine, and developing, building up our armored warfare capability, tanks and things like that. He was known for the attacks in Casablanca, North Africa, successes against the Desert Fox Erwin Rommel, and then later on, in 1943, the Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy, the soft underbelly of Europe, as Churchill called it. And lastly, at the Battle of the Bulge. He was not involved at Normandy, even though he proved to be a very skilled commander, because his army was actually used as a decoy at Calais. Calais was the nearest point, at Dover. Dover was the nearest point from Calais in France, which is where Hitler was convinced that the Allies would invade if they did, and they even had Patton's phony army there, planes made of wood and stuff like that, to make it appear like they were amassing an army there, when in fact the invasion for D-Day came from somewhere else. He died in a Jeep accident during the war still, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. If you want to see more about him, watch the Academy Award winning Best Picture Patton. George C. Scott played Patton. All right, a German officer, Erwin Rommel. Rommel was kind of considered Patton's sort of rival or arch nemesis. He earned the nickname Desert Fox because of his successes in North Africa. He was early on a Panzer commander. The Panzer are the German tank divisions, but eventually became a field marshal. Field marshal is basically a general. So he later on led the German defense at D-Day as well. He was one of the most trusted and skilled German officers. He's actually considered a very humane officer when they got orders to execute Jewish civilians or soldiers. He usually ignored those orders, and later on was even linked to one of the conspiracies to assassinate Hitler late in the war, which failed. Back to the Americans. General Douglas MacArthur was one of five five-star generals ever. Well, general of the U.S. Army, I think is what it's called. So he was one of five, along with Eisenhower and a few others. He was the commander of the U.S. Army in the Far East, as they called it back then, basically in Asia. When Japan invaded in the Philippines the day after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Air Force was destroyed there. He retreated, well, the whole military retreated to Bataan, and he and a few other officers were able to escape to Australia, but he vowed to return to the Philippines. Those captured U.S. forces at Bataan faced what became infamously called later on the Bataan Death March. Go Google that or check out the blog for it. He oversaw the occupation of Japan after the war, and he eventually led the United States during the Korean War as well, which we'll talk about next week. And here is the very famous photograph, which apparently had to be taken twice because there wasn't a camera guy there, so they got back in the boat. So Douglas MacArthur, who had like a huge ego, and you'll see that later on when we talk about the Korean War as well, and had aspirations of becoming president perhaps as well, wanted this photograph taken, and he said, "I have returned," as he promised, and he did. General Dwight David Eisenhower, maybe one of the most, probably the most well-known of the American generals of the war, was also a five-star general and was given supreme Allied command of Allied troops in North Africa and then later on in Europe. So Normandy was all under his. So he was Patton's boss and all the other generals in Europe as well. When the concentration camps were quote-unquote discovered, because there's a lot of belief that American higher-ups knew that those things existed. He ordered camera crews to come in and document all of this stuff, and later on that evidence was used at the Nuremberg trials. He had a very illustrious career afterwards. He was later the Army Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff is the guy who, they're not out at war, but they're in Washington, and they're basically the boss of all of the militaries, right below the president. He was later on the NATO Supreme Commander, President of Columbia University, and, of course, President of the United States of America twice. And before the war, he was considered very mediocre. So here is a visit to the concentration camps. So we've got General Eisenhower here, General Patton in the back, another one of the five-star generals who actually was very involved in the attack at Normandy, was General Omar Bradley. He's another important one. He's right there. General Eisenhower talking to some of the capos, as they were called in the concentration camps, and what they saw there really really shocked them. Shocked them so much so that, and here again is Eisenhower and Patton with Bradley, that Patton, when he got to Buchenwald and saw these kinds of scenes, actually ordered German citizens of the nearby towns to march through these camps to see what had been done, to see what, their leaders, who they had elected, had done. So that's very much in the style of what Patton would do. Last guy, George C. Marshall. He is Eisenhower's boss, and whose only boss really was Franklin Roosevelt, and then later on Harry Truman. George C. Marshall was also a five-star general, chief of staff of the U.S. Army, chief of staff. So I mean, he's today chief of staff. I mean, he's basically in Washington, kind of like commander of all U.S. forces. So he's by Churchill once called the organizer of victory. Later on, he became the U.S. Secretary of State, and the Marshall Plan to save Europe and help it recover, save it from communism, that is, was orchestrated by him, and he even won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953 for his efforts. All right, that's it. Again, we're going to come back to some of these guys surely in the future. So, thank you. Come again.